This weekend, Avengers Infinity War, the culmination of the entire MCU, hits theaters. That means today we're going to stop and rank all 19 movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe from the worst to the best. Now, before I give you my ranking, go ahead and tell me down below in the comment section, how do you rank the MCU? Which ones do you love? Which ones do you hate? And go ahead and tell me why, because we can talk about what numbers we put next to them, but it's a lot more interesting to talk about why we love or hate certain movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. One last thing before we get started, this video is brought to you by Amino. Amino is a totally free smartphone app, which is essentially a collection of communities for almost any interest you can think of. Seriously, this app has the largest selection of communities I've ever seen on social media. My personal favorites are Marvel, Black Panther, and The Office. Once you join a particular Amino, you can browse the feed of featured posts. You can also find fan art, quizzes, polls, and wikis. I frequently find myself getting sucked into polls and quizzes over on The Office and MCU Aminos. But the best part of this app is that you're able to find people who are interested in the same things that you are. You can chat with people using text, voice, or avatar chat. I posted a poll in the Marvel Amino asking, which is the best Avengers movie? Download the app and join the Marvel Amino to cast your vote. To download Amino, follow the link in the description. Once you download the app, be sure to follow me. My username's simple enough. Sean Chandler Talks About. With that said, let's get started. In last place is Iron Man 2. Now, I don't hate this movie. I actually find it pretty watchable. That should tell you everything you need to know about how I feel about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that the movie I put in last place, I still kind of enjoy. The problem here is that the narrative is all over the place. It's telling a story about Tony Stark and the government, Tony Stark and Justin Hammer, Tony Stark and his dad, Tony Stark and S.H.I.E.L.D., Tony and Whiplash. You got a story about Tony and his heart and his alcoholism. And with so many stories going along, we don't get to dive into any of them long enough to care or get a sense of urgency because we just keep jumping from one story to the next story to the next story. So there's no forward momentum throughout the story, just action sequences pop up here and there. Now, granted, Jon Favreau knows how to stage a great action sequences, so when they do happen, they're great. The cast is great, so they have wonderful chemistry, so there's fun times to be had. That's why the movie's still watchable. At times, the movie just feels like an Avengers setup movie, and this is easily the most disjointed narrative of the entire MCU. At number 18 is Thor: The Dark World. For me, this movie just falls flat, and a lot of that comes down to the fact that this movie has the most forgettable villain of the entire MCU. And if you think through the movie, there are some serious stakes in the movie. There's consequences to Asgard, characters die, but when these moments happen, you don't feel the emotions that you're supposed to have. And I think one of the reasons for that is the movie's tone is very uneven. It starts off a little bit like Lord of the Rings in space, and then it goes to Earth, and it's kind of like a romantic comedy. And then when Loki comes to the picture and teams up with Thor, suddenly it's kind of like this jokey comedy. And so the movie just feels uneven throughout the entire film. The relationship between Thor and Jane is even weaker in this film than it was in the previous film. The end result is just a very mediocre film. At number 17 is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Now, I know a ton of you love this movie, and I totally respect that. I'm not trying to hate on the movie. I wanted to love this movie. It was actually my most anticipated movie of last year. But when I saw it, I just didn't like it. And I've tried to rewatch it multiple times, hoping that I'll like it, hoping that I see what you see in it. And I just don't. It's not a movie for me. James Gunn decided to use a more character-based narrative than action-based, and this led to some amazing character moments in the film, but for me, it left the storyline seriously lacking. Both the plotline with the Sovereign, which I just found very dull, or even the plotline with Ego just wasn't compelling to me. I also found the tone very uneven. In one moment, it would almost do self-parody or Looney Tunes type humor, and then it would cut to scenes of Groot being tortured, people being launched into space, and patricide, and those two things just didn't sit well right next to each other with me. And since Ego wasn't revealed as the main villain until the second half of the movie, I felt like the plot just meandered around. There was no sense of urgency moving the story forward. So for me, this was probably the most disappointing movie in the entire MCU. At number 16 is The Incredible Hulk. A lot of people don't realize this movie is in the MCU because Edward Norton didn't return to play Bruce Banner in later films. However, this movie is from Marvel Studios. Robert Downey Jr. appears as Tony Stark in this film. It is in the MCU, and I actually think it's a pretty good movie. I don't understand a lot of the hate that people have for this movie. It feels very different. It doesn't have the humor or the tone of later movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but I think the story's structured nicely. It's actually a good narrative to take the Hulk on, and the final fight with Abomination, I think, is one of the most underrated fights in the entire MCU. Seeing two gigantic monsters duke it out in the streets, putting cars on their fists as boxing gloves, I think it's a great little sequence, and so I think this movie's actually very underrated by a lot of people, and there's a lot of enjoyment to be had in it. At number 15 is Captain America: The First Avenger. It actually kind of breaks my heart a little bit to have this movie so far down in the list, because I absolutely love the first hour of this movie when it's telling the origin story of Steve Rogers. That's some of my favorite stuff in the entire MCU, some of the most emotionally stirring for me. I also love the production design, the way they did the 1940s, and Alan Silvestri's score is one of the absolute bests in the entire MCU. The problem here is, for me, the movie loses steam whenever it cuts away to the Red Skull. I just don't find his plotline particularly compelling at all, and a lot of it just feels like exposition dumping. And then it loses steam once again as soon as Steve Rogers becomes Captain America, rescues the POWs, and then it montages through World War II and just kind of cuts to a third act climax. If they'd found a way to tell this story with a stronger narrative structure throughout the entire movie, this easily could have been one of my favorite movies in the entire MCU. Coming in at number 14 is Iron Man 3. This is a frustrating one for me because I love some of the action sequences, whether you're talking about that plane rescue or the climax at the end of the movie with all the Iron Man suits. That stuff is excellent. Shane Black's dialogue for Tony Stark is on point. His chemistry and relationship with everyone, including a kid, is excellent. There's also some great character development for Stark as he's processing what happened in the Avengers. The problem here is the movie's trying so hard to be clever and subversive that it trades in a potentially excellent villain in the Mandarin for a very mediocre generic villain in Killian. The end result is the movie kind of cutting its own legs off by the end. Number 13 is Thor. This is a movie to me that's never quite as good as its parts. Chris Hemsworth is phenomenal in this role. It's the part that he was designed to play. I love the Shakespearean grandeur that Kenneth Branagh brought to Asgard in the film. And when the movie gets to Earth, I think the fish out of water comedy works really well. But at the same time, the tonal shift that happens when we go from the grandeur of Asgard to this small city in New Mexico always felt a little bit off to me, like it doesn't flow quite right. Also, since the main conflict of the movie really is Thor's inner struggle with his own ego, the movie doesn't have a sense of urgency in the conflict that we're trying to overcome in the film. And of course, the relationship between Jane and Thor is never as good as it should be, especially since it's only really a 2-day weekend romance. So while it's a very good movie, it's never as great as its individual parts. Coming in at number 12 is Avengers Age of Ultron. This is one of the most frustrating movies on the list because the highs are really high and the lows are pretty low for me. There's some amazing character moments in this movie. It actually has much deeper themes and rich emotions than the first Avengers movie. There's just as many amazing action sequences like the Hulk sequence with Hulkbuster battling him, the final battle with Ultron. They give everyone their moment to shine, and there's all of these amazing, iconic shots in all of the action. And of course, it's also got Joss Whedon's great dialogue and humor. The problem here is this is probably the most confusing movie in the entire MCU. There's always kind of a balance in storytelling between telling the audience too much or telling them too little, and this movie definitely tells us too little. And this problem's compounded by the fact that there's so many plot lines going on and little elements where they're setting up future movies, like sending Thor on a bathtub sequence to set up Ragnarok, that it's hard to figure out exactly what's going on, even though the basic narrative of it is fairly straightforward. It feels to me like you either needed to trim a little bit more off the movie or add a little bit more to the movie. Either way, you could have gone from a very good movie to a great movie. At number 11 is Ant-Man. For me, this movie is a very refreshing change of pace in that it's not about saving the world. It's a simple heist story with a very contained setting. In many different senses, it has a very small scale. Speaking of a small scale, I love the way they did the Ant-Man shrieking effect, the way they did the camera work with the really deep depth of field. The cast, as always, is phenomenal. It's just great to see someone like Paul Rudd become a superhero in his 40s. Likewise, getting someone like Michael Douglas in a film like this just brings a certain legitimacy to a film. And while it firmly feels like an MCU film with its humor, it also finds its own little way to do humor with all the Michael Peña's storytelling and all that fun stuff. The only place the movie struggles for me is that the main plot line with the villain feels a little bit familiar to the original Iron Man movie, but all in all, this movie's a ton of fun in a non-pretentious kind of way. Bringing us into the top 10 is Doctor Strange. When I heard they were making this movie, I was really nervous. I wasn't sure how they were going to pull this movie off, but they absolutely did. They found a way to introduce us to this world of sorcery and give us a ton of background, but in a way that's an engaging, fun, and funny, and fits inside of the Marvel world. But really, the standout here is just the visuals. I loved everything about how they visualized the world of sorcery. Whether you're talking about their spinny hand stuff, the kaleidoscope world, the mirror stuff, all of it, just a visual feast, because it's not just CGI thrown up on the screen, it's artistic in the way they decided to visualize it. But I will say, of all the movies in the MCU, this is the one where I can feel the Marvel template the most. I understand they're trying to take the weird world of Doctor Strange and sorcery and make it for a broad audience, but you can feel them trying to do that. But this is a very cool movie that is thoroughly enjoyable. Coming in at number 9 is Thor Ragnarok. After Thor the Dark World just fell flat, they decided to take it in a wildly different direction and crank up the humor, crank up the color scheme, give us this amazing synthesized score, and make a movie that's an absolute blast. Whether you're talking about Chris Hemsworth getting to do his full funny Chris Hemsworth throughout the entire movie, whether you're talking about characters like Korg getting Jeff Goldblum in the mix. This is also a movie that has some serious dramatic tension inside of it. But that's also one of the problems with the movie, is because it's trying so hard to be funny, sometimes it undercuts the drama and the tension and the conflict by putting jokes in where they just don't fit. I feel like if they would have cut out like 5% or 10% of the humor, the movie might have been 20% better. Number 8 is Spider-Man Homecoming. Like Ant-Man, this is another refreshing change of pace for the MCU for a couple of different reasons. The first one, it's from the perspective of a high schooler who has high school problems, who does high school type things, and has the maturity of a high schooler. And this just puts a very interesting twist on a superhero story, as well as just a movie inside the MCU and the way things are perceived. Also, it's a nice refreshing change of pace because the scale of the story is so much smaller. Our main villain, the Vulture, is, well, kind of like a vulture trying to like prey on some technology. Speaking of the Vulture, Michael Keaton is great, of course. And what makes him so cool is he's just as terrifying sitting in a car as he is with his suit on flying in the sky. It also sets us up for some great character development for Peter Parker, as well as Tony Stark, seeing him in a different light in this movie as the mentor. My only real issue with the movie is I don't really care for the Tony Stark Spider-Man suit. Besides that, this movie is just a ton of fun. Coming in at number 7 is Black Panther. If Spider-Man Homecoming took things in a high school direction, this movie takes things in a very adult direction by tackling a bunch of themes that are very relevant to today's society. Whereas so many movies in the MCU are about a superhero fighting a supervillain, this movie's about a king and his kingdom. And in doing so, it has very Shakespearean themes by having family members battling to see who will rule on the throne. And what's great about it is it just has true conflict in the movie, as there's different worldviews that drive the characters' actions throughout the film. And this gives the movie an emotional resonance that extends far beyond what you'd expect from the film. Also, this movie has some of the best world building in any of the movies inside the MCU, because we have to learn about this world of Wakanda so quickly, and the movie just does it so efficiently. All in all, this might be the most mature film in the entire MCU. At number 6 is Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Of all the movies inside of the MCU, in a certain sense, this is the most grounded of the bunch, as it's essentially a political thriller inside of the MCU. It has some of the biggest plot twists and reveals of all the films inside of this franchise, as we learn about Hydra and the infiltration of S.H.I.E.L.D. We learn what actually happened to Bucky, and Steve's gotta go off and do his own thing. The Russo brothers crafted one of the best stories inside of the MCU by meticulously looking at the details and plot points to make sure everything moves forward with a logic running throughout all of it. They also crafted some of the absolute best fight sequences inside of the entire MCU with this cool little elevator sequence and several others that are just awesome to look at. And for me, this is the first movie where Black Widow really got to shine as a character. I know a lot of you have this one even higher up on your list. It never hit me with that much emotional level the way it did a lot of you guys, but this is a great movie. Bringing us into the top 5 is Guardians of the Galaxy. For me, this movie was the biggest surprise of the entire MCU and probably the one I have the most nostalgia for. I went into this one not knowing a whole lot about the Guardians of the Galaxy, but finding the trailers intriguing, and I just fell in love with these characters in this world that James Gunn crafted. And the thing that makes it work so well is the humor is just so on point. Everyone has these little moments to shine, and they did an amazing job of hiding it in the trailers. Like, the funniest character to me was Drax, and they hid all of that in the trailers. So when you went into that movie that first time, you discovered how funny Dave Bautista could be. And the thing that ties it all together is that this is a movie that has something to say about family and broken people, and it does it so well that we actually get kind of teary-eyed when a tree dies. All in all, while I don't think this is necessarily the best movie in the MCU, it is definitely one of my favorites. Coming in at number 4 is Iron Man. Rewatching this movie, it almost feels a little bit quaint because the world has expanded so much since this movie came out. But that's kind of the brilliance of this movie. It established this world, it put all the pieces in place while telling an origin story that stands alone. The glue that holds this movie together is absolutely Robert Downey Jr., who has amazing chemistry with everyone in this movie. He elevates every person around him and just makes it so watchable and fun from beginning to end. Jon Favreau finds a way to bring an energy to the entire film, like a sequence where Tony Stark's testing out new suits should seem boring, but instead it's a standout sequence. While later movies had bigger action sequences, a faster stream of jokes, the simple freshness and lack of pretense in this movie makes it one of the best for me. Coming in at number 3 is Captain America: Civil War. Now, this is a movie that is great on so many different levels. First off, it's amazing to see all these characters crammed in one movie, duking it out. But what makes it so much better is they earned the right to do that by establishing different worldviews throughout the previous movies in the MCU leading up to this film. So when we get here, we understand why the team is pulled in different directions. The fact that audiences are split down the middle as to whether they're Team Tony Stark or Team Steve Rogers, and they can't decide which one's the bigger jerk in the movie, tells you just how great of a job the Russo brothers did crafting a movie where you understand the different sides to it. Add to that, you've got a character like Zemo as kind of the chess master making the pieces move. From there, you just move on to that amazing airport sequence that's just kind of a dream come true for comic book fans. This is a movie that shows you that blockbusters can have big spectacle and have complex plots and entertain just the same. Our runner-up is The Avengers. This movie was kind of like lightning in a bottle where they just nailed it. This movie probably has the sharpest banter of any of the movies inside of the MCU. This movie also has the best, most satisfying third act of any movie inside of the MCU. That final battle just pulls all the strings, has all the right moments, has all the right iconic shots that just make you go, yes, 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 this is what I want. While the story's fairly straightforward, the movie feels a little bit like they made a gigantic wish list of moments that they want in the film, and they found a way to work all of them into the movie. So from beginning to end, I just had a big, gigantic grin on my face when I first saw it in the theater, and rewatching it a couple months ago with my son, I had just as big of a grin on my face. This is a movie that just absolutely delivers on a fun summer blockbuster experience. But my new number one movie is Avengers Infinity War. For 18 movies, they built up to this movie, and it absolutely delivered on the promise of that buildup. It had big ambitions, it had big scale, and they found a way to pull it all together. The characters have great chemistry, the humor's present, but there's also tragedy and death and sacrifice. It delivers on so many levels, and I'm certainly not going to spoil anything, but this movie has the biggest twist and the most unexpected turns of any movie inside of the MCU. And the thing that pulls this movie all together is Thanos, who's probably the best villain in the MCU at this point in time. I had no clue they were going to give him the emotional resonance and depth and backstory that they give him. And it just pulls this movie together. I didn't know if they'd be able to pull off a movie this big, and they absolutely did. As of this moment, this is, in my mind, the best movie in the MCU. So there you have it. That's my take on all 19 movies of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But how about you? Tell me your ranking down below in the comment section. And remember, I'm a lot more interested in the why as opposed to the what. I'd much rather talk about your ideas about the movies than what number we put next to them. Also, remember to download the Amino app and answer my poll in the Marvel Amino. With that said, if you're new to my channel, please consider clicking that subscribe button. I do movie reviews, TV reviews, ranking videos, but the key thing is I don't want to just talk about movies, I want to talk about movies with you. So join me down in the comment section. Let's have a lively yet respectful conversation where we can talk about which movies we love, which ones we hate, and why. And as always, thank you so much for watching.